I work the graveyard shift as a security guard at a recycling yard. For confidentiality reasons, I can't disclose the company name. I've been stationed here for 2 weeks, currently on my 2nd week. Throughout my shift, I conduct regular patrols across a vast recycling yard, filled with valuable metals that are broken down and sold. My main responsibility is to scan various checkpoints and ensure that no unauthorized individuals are present in the yard or facility. One of my additional tasks involves navigating through a grassy and bushy area, as well as crossing a set of train tracks, to capture a photo of a distant warehouse. This procedure ensures that the area is safe and clear. To illuminate my path, I rely on a powerful flashlight with 2K lumens, allowing me to see clearly across the entire yard. About an hour and a half ago, during one of my rounds, I proceeded through the grass and over the train tracks to take the warehouse photo as usual. After capturing the image and submitting it, an intense feeling washed over me, as if someone were watching my every move. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I found myself frozen in place. My flashlight remained on, pointing towards the warehouse. Slowly, I turned around, directing the beam of light behind me. To my astonishment, approximately 10 yards away, I spotted a slender, elderly man with a long white beard, sitting on a chair. His eyes were fixed directly on me. He wore soiled denim overalls and what appeared to be a Western-style cowboy fedora. Underneath the overalls, his skin was exposed. Now, I'm a 6-foot-tall, 220-pound individual, but I must admit that I let out a scream akin to that of a startled child. Truly embarrassing. Startled, I dropped my flashlight, scattering thin, sharp metal shards across the ground. The sudden shock left me temporarily blinded. Amidst the darkness, all I could hear were rapid footsteps, accompanied by the clanging of metal. The sounds approached me swiftly, closing the gap to around 5 feet. Then, within a matter of seconds, the footsteps abruptly veered to my left and sped past me. As the metal clanging faded into the distance, the rustling of bushes followed suit. Gaining composure, I retrieved my fallen flashlight and aimed its beam towards the source of the sound. However, the old man had vanished, disappearing beyond the bushes into an unknown location. Shaking from a mixture of adrenaline and fear, I managed to steady my breathing and promptly contacted several emergency personnel. However, by the time they arrived, the old man had long fled the scene. My belief is that he may have merely been observing the passing trains, given that his metal chair was oriented towards the tracks. It still remains there, and I took a photograph as a personal keepsake. Unfortunately, I can't share it within this group, as photo uploads are not permitted. Now I find myself in the office, still gripped by terror and solitude. I have the rest of my shift to complete tonight, followed by another exhausting 11-hour graveyard shift tomorrow. Despite my lingering apprehension, quitting is not an option, as I desperately need the income. I simply needed to unload this unsettling experience from my mind and share it with others. During the 90s, I resided in a small college town in Pennsylvania with my mother and brother. Our humble abode was a 1-story house situated at the corner next to Yup. Unfortunately, my mother wasn't the most responsible parent, often leaving us home alone at a tender age. One day, she intended to walk to the nearby grocery store, which was a 10 to 15-minute stroll away. While she initially invited me to join her, I made the decision to stay home. The exact reason escapes my memory, but a few minutes after her departure, I had a change of heart. Glancing out the window, I spotted her at the intersection, accompanied by my little brother. Frantically, I rushed towards her, shouting, "I want to go, I want to go." In response, she advised me to grab a jacket. Hurriedly, I darted back home, retrieved a jacket, and returned to the intersection, only to find my mother absent. Presumably, she had grown impatient and departed. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a man, possibly in his early 20s, adorned in a black trench coat with spiked hair. Strapped with rollerblades, he began approaching me. Being an overly cautious child, paranoia set in, prompting me to sprint as fast as my legs could carry me. Unbeknownst to me, the sound of his rollerblades echoed behind, indicating his swift pursuit. Reaching my house, I swiftly entered, securing the door behind me. Seizing a metal pipe that had recently detached from something in the bathroom, I sought refuge beneath my bed. A symphony of knocks and eventually forceful pounding reverberated at my front door, sending shivers down my spine. Fear consumed me as I contemplated that this could be the end. Yet, amidst the terror, I resolved to fight back if my life was in jeopardy. I vowed to strike him with all my might, ready to confront the intruder head-on. Gradually, the knocking ceased, though my heart continued racing. Time seemed to stretch on indefinitely as I waited in agonizing silence. Eventually, mustering the courage, I cautiously emerged from beneath my bed, only to encounter his chilling gaze through the window. Overwhelmed by fear, I let out a scream and swiftly retreated back under my bed, eagerly awaiting my mother's return. When she finally arrived, I poured out the details of the horrifying ordeal. Sadly, she dismissed my account, failing to believe my words. This disbelief has plagued me ever since. I have often pondered what the mysterious man wanted and what he would have done to me had he caught me. During my younger years, around the age of 13, I used to babysit for a neighbor with whom I had a close bond. Despite my young age, I was considered mature and had been friends with her kids before they moved in with their father, who lived a couple of hours away. For the sake of privacy, let's refer to my neighbor as C and her son, who is on the spectrum, as J. One Friday night, I found myself with no plans, and C asked if I could watch J while she went out to meet a guy she had been friends with for a couple of years. Before delving into the events, it's important to understand some context about C. She had a wide network of acquaintances, not all of whom were reputable. The children in the neighborhood were aware of this, as we had spent our childhood and early teenage years taking care of her kids and babysitting whenever she needed assistance. C had connections and a significant social status within our community, ranging from those who lived just minutes away to others who were located hours away. So when C asked me on that random Friday night about a guy's name I had never heard before, it didn't come as a surprise. Considering C's circumstances as a single mother juggling 3 jobs while taking care of 2 kids and a toddler, I understood that her material possessions, such as her house, car, and clothes, weren't extravagant. Around 10 p.m., after spending a relatively easy 4 hours with Jay, I changed him into his pajamas and put him to bed. Knowing his love for the movie Cars at the time, I played it for him, and he quickly fell asleep. This left me alone in the living room. Curious about C's whereabouts, I called her to see if she was on her way home. As I made the call, she mentioned she was leaving the bar. I could tell she was quite intoxicated, and I hoped the guy she was with would drive her the short distance to her house. Approximately 7 minutes later, I noticed a sleek 2017 BM Daplio 3 Series pulling into the driveway, which surprised and raised my suspicions. I glanced out the window to see if C was in the passenger seat. As mentioned earlier, C didn't possess luxurious belongings, so this struck me as odd. I saw her stumble out of the car, accompanied by the man who walked her into the house. I greeted him, but he didn't provide his name. Instead, he smiled and thanked me for watching Jay so he could spend time with C. I assured him it wasn't a problem and wished them a good time. Skipping ahead by 10 minutes, C asked me where Jay was. I informed her that it was late, so I put him to bed and suggested she change into comfortable clothes. However, she ended up lying down in her bed fully clothed and promptly fell asleep. This left me, a young teenager, alone with a man in his 40s who had thinning hair. We sat on the kitchen floor and engaged in a random deep conversation. At one point, he asked me to knock on his ribs out of curiosity. Surprisingly, I heard a distinct metallic thump, as if his ribs were made of metal. Taken aback, I asked him about it and what had caused it. He sighed, leaned back, and lifted his shirt slightly, revealing a skin graft on his abdomen with a noticeably different shade of skin and stitches surrounding it. Noticing scars on his stomach and chest, some resembling bullet wounds, I couldn't help but inquire further. He closed his eyes and began telling me a story. According to him, his ex-girlfriend had intentionally run him over with a car, not just once but 13 times, 2 years prior. My jaw dropped as I contemplated the myriad of reasons why someone would subject another person to such a horrific ordeal. My mind raced, and I couldn't help but wonder if I was in danger. These were the obvious questions one would ask oneself when confronted with such a situation. And so the story unfolded. He explained that he had proposed to his girlfriend the week before, and she had organized a barbecue to announce it to her family. Upon arriving and seeing her cooking, he noticed the barbecue being prepared with skepticism since she had never made one before. When he took a bite, he discovered it was extremely dry, causing him to cough discreetly. When she asked if it was good, he reluctantly said yes to avoid a fight. However, he couldn't stop coughing, and when she inquired about what was wrong, he confessed that it was a little dry. This triggered an argument, and he decided to head to his car. Unfortunately, she beat him to it and deliberately hit him with her car while reversing, running over his ribs 13 times. It was astounding that he had survived such a traumatic experience. I was in shock, trying to comprehend how someone could endure such an ordeal. Questions flooded my mind. Was this older man joking? Was this story real? Who was he? So I mustered the courage to ask him, "But who are you? What's your name?" He looked at me, his eyes shifting, and responded with a deadly seriousness. "Which one?" "The name I was given at birth." He briefly chuckled but abruptly stopped, revealing that he had hundreds of names and couldn't disclose a single one. He claimed to be wanted in 12 countries and various regions along the West Coast. As anxiety washed over me, I started to perspire. I had no clue whether he was being genuine or if it was all a fabrication. Then he pulled out his wallet, unveiling at least 10 identification cards. It dawned on me. This was real. He stared into my eyes and said, "If you or C ever need someone gone, erased from your lives just like that," snapping his fingers for emphasis, "tell C to reach out, and I can make it happen." With that, he rose, opened the door, got into his luxurious car, and disappeared from my sight. This entire incident would have been eerie or unsettling on its own if it had ended there. Perhaps he was merely joking, playing a prank on me. However, it only grew worse. The following morning, I approached C and asked her about the name of the guy she had come home with. Confused, she responded, "What guy?" I described his car, injured ribs, and bald head, but she had no idea what I was talking about. To this day, I remain clueless about the identity of that man, his real name, where he came from, and whether he was lying or even real. A year ago, I found myself using a local app where I could connect with people in my area. It was there that I came across a pleasant girl who shared similar interests. We hit it off right away, exchanging numbers and photos. Everything seemed perfect, almost too perfect. She showered me with compliments, remarking on my gentlemanlike behavior for the ladies reading this post. It was a new experience for me to have someone so infatuated, even though she may not have been conventionally attractive. She made me feel a certain way. Eventually, we decided to meet on a Saturday afternoon, and we had a nice time together. Later, we went to her place and had a great time. I wanted to stay the night, but she declined. I wondered if my performance had deterred her interest, but I didn't dwell on it. I carried on with my day, leaving her house. However, she hadn't lost interest. Just 30 minutes after I arrived home, she messaged me, ensuring I had arrived safely. We continued texting about life and other topics, but nothing significant happened until 2 weeks later. After finishing my studies, I wanted to see her again. However, something felt different. Her messages lacked emojis and were more direct, which was unlike her usual style. Nevertheless, my desires clouded my judgment, and I didn't pay much attention to it. It was almost as if someone else was behind her phone, but I didn't care. I suggested picking her up with my car at her house, but she insisted on meeting at a local park since she needed to fuel up her car. The meeting time was set for when it would already be getting dark, which struck me as suspicious. Nonetheless, I didn't find it strange at the time. When I asked why we were meeting at the park, she replied sharply, telling me not to ask foolish questions and simply be there on time. I responded with a casual "lol, okay." When I arrived at the park, waiting for her, she came 10 minutes later. I didn't mind. I was just happy to see her again. As she parked her car, a strange feeling washed over me. I sensed that something was terribly wrong, but I couldn't quite pinpoint it. I looked around, checking the surroundings, glancing into the bushes to ensure no one was lying in wait. She remained inside her car for the next 2 to 3 minutes, and I brushed it off as a silly, unfunny joke, something she had done before. The windows of her car were tinted, so I couldn't see inside. I stood about 20 to 30 meters away, waiting for her to step out, but she didn't. I smiled at her car, perhaps out of nervousness, believing she was playing an unfunny prank on me, as I had suspected. Then suddenly, my phone rang. As I reached for it, I heard multiple car doors opening. The car was parked horizontally, obstructing my view of any additional passengers. In an instant, my body went into fight or flight mode. I knew something was terribly wrong. Without even looking back to see who or what emerged from the car, I ran for my life. After managing to escape, I promptly deleted and blocked her number. To this day, I suspect she cheated on her boyfriend, and he somehow discovered it, leading to his violent intentions towards me. The news is filled with stories of people reacting violently due to infidelity, and I had no desire to become another statistic. I even questioned if she was truly in the car. It's likely there were 2 or more individuals with malicious intentions. I was surprised at how swiftly I ran when the adrenaline kicked in. The feeling was indescribable. This incident occurred just 3 weeks ago, and it has been on my mind ever since. I am certain that both my patient and I narrowly avoided falling prey to a predator. As part of my work for the state, I assist individuals dealing with substance abuse disorders, mental illness, and to a lesser extent, mild developmental delays. My role in supporting those with developmental delays is akin to that of a lower-ranking social worker. One of my responsibilities is to ensure that participants can achieve their personal goals for the year, much like an individualized education program, IEP, in public schools. One particular patient had set a goal to walk or hike at least 1 mile 3 times a week. During my visit to her home, observing her accomplish this goal was crucial. Thus, she took both of us on a walking and slight hiking trail close by. We happened to be around the same age, both being 40. As we walked and talked along the trail, we reached a point that was more secluded. We had moved away from the path and circling a neighborhood pond, where many people frequented. Instead, we found ourselves on a trail that led us through the woods and a cotton field. While we continued our walk, my patient suddenly stopped in her tracks. I looked at her, and just as she was about to express her unease, a strong feeling washed over me. It was as if someone was watching us intently. Due to our developmental delays, I felt a heightened concern for her well-being over my own. It's challenging to articulate, but instead of fear, I felt a deep sense of protectiveness toward her. I glanced behind us upon hearing the sound of leaves crunching. Lo and behold, a man in his 30s emerged from the woods, slowly advancing toward us. Given our isolated surroundings and his unexpected appearance, I knew that his intentions were malicious. In a bid to ensure my patient's safety, I urged her to continue walking, providing her with a head start. I'm not entirely sure why I did it, but I turned around completely, halting my progress, and fixed my gaze directly on him. We locked eyes, and in that moment, it was as if he realized that we were aware of his presence. He froze in his tracks, ceasing his approach. I maintained my unwavering stare, then began walking back toward my patient to emphasize that my attention was focused on him. As I moved backward, I noticed my patient glance back at him, only to find that he had vanished into the woods as abruptly as he had appeared. If his intention had been solely to stroll along the nature trail, why did he stop as soon as I turned to face him? Why didn't he merely continue walking past us? It became apparent to me that this individual had been waiting and observing, hoping for a woman or women to venture onto that isolated trail. His emergence from the woods at that precise moment made it clear that he had been concealing himself and engaging in predatory behavior. I am forever convinced that both my patient's premonition and my own sense of being watched saved us from whatever he had intended to do. Occasionally, a memory resurfaces, reminding me of the valuable lesson my parents instilled in us about the dangers of trusting strangers. I am especially grateful to my sister for heeding that advice. Allow me to recount an incident from the 90s when my two siblings and I were walking from home to our school bus stop. For context, I was 7 years old, my brother was 8, and my sister was nearly 11. On that foggy morning, the surroundings were eerily silent as we made our way towards the bus stop. With no one else in sight, a small white sedan gradually approached us, matching our pace. Curiosity mixed with confusion as we glanced at the vehicle. A white woman with long curly brown hair occupied the driver's seat, staring intently at us. Judging by her appearance, she seemed to be around 35 to 40 years old. This strange encounter continued for a few seconds before she rolled down her window and casually asked, "Hey kids, are you heading to school?" Sporting an unsettling smile, her eyes seemingly piercing through us, we nodded, our backpacks making it obvious. Invitingly, she waved at us and suggested, "Why don't you three hop in? I can give you a ride to school." As a lazy 7-year-old, the idea of a free ride thrilled me, and I enthusiastically replied, "Sure." But my sister, gripping my arm tightly, responded firmly, "No thanks." The woman's smile faded momentarily before quickly reappearing. "Oh, it's fine. You don't have to walk. I can take you there quickly," she insisted, attempting to sound kind. A chill ran down my spine, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My sister's voice grew even sterner as she repeated, "No." My brother appeared frightened, while I stood there, confused and alarmed by his expression. At that moment, the woman turned the steering wheel, bringing the car closer to the curb, almost reaching us. Fear paralyzed us, and we froze in our tracks. "Get in the car," she commanded, coming to a halt. Her smile vanished, replaced by a wicked sneer, and as she drew nearer, I could see her eyes, dark pits of pure evil, glaring at us. That was the tipping point. My sister swiftly picked me up and shouted at my brother to run. Miraculously, she mustered incredible strength, akin to the Hulk, and together, they sprinted down the sidewalk as fast as they could. Clutching onto my sister, I screamed, and we narrowly avoided stumbling twice in the process. Thankfully, the car never pursued us. Instead, it accelerated and turned onto another street. We didn't stop running until we reached the safety of our home. Sobbing, we locked the door, waiting for our working parents to return. Back then, we only had landlines, and pagers were exclusively for adults. In retrospect, if it weren't for my sister's quick thinking, I might have fallen victim to a kidnapping with unimaginable consequences. This incident serves as a stark reminder to teach children never to trust strangers, an important lesson that, regrettably, I failed to heed. A few years ago, when I was a new mother, I found myself at home with my newborn child. It was time for me to get an oil change and rotate the tires on my car. Instead of sitting in the dealership waiting room for hours, I saw it as an opportunity to take a walk in a nearby arboretum. Although I had visited the arboretum multiple times before, this particular visit caught my attention because of a sign indicating a trail called Patriot's Path. This paved trail spanned 35 miles across the county and was divided into segments due to roadways and neighborhoods. Having explored parts of the path previously without feeling uneasy, I thought it would be a great way to pass the time. So with my baby in a stroller, I eagerly embarked on this new section of the trail. Initially, the path led through tall grasses before gradually becoming more wooded. This transition didn't concern me since the other parts of the trail I had walked on were predominantly in the woods. As I enjoyed my time in nature, pushing my newborn in the stroller, I came across a fork in the path. The other sections I had encountered before were always a single, uninterrupted path. However, this time, I had to choose between two paths. Opting for the higher ground, I proceeded along the right path. Soon enough, I realized that the stroller was struggling on the increasingly challenging terrain. Tree roots had broken through the path, making the ride rough for my baby. Unable to maintain my previous pace, I decided to consult my map app to see if this particular section was included and where it would lead us. According to the map, the left side of the fork followed a waterway. Given this information, I made the decision to take that route. Just as I turned around, I noticed a well-dressed man slowly walking towards us with his phone up to his face, seemingly engaged in a call. However, he wasn't speaking. As we approached each other, I expected the usual friendly nod, but he kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, expressionless. This peculiar interaction triggered a sense of unease within me. The man's attire appeared more business casual, unlike most people I encountered on the trails who were dressed in exercise clothes. Furthermore, he wasn't speaking on the phone, which he held up to his ear, and his other hand remained concealed behind his back, as if concealing something from view. Despite my growing unease, I convinced myself it was just my imagination and continued along the other path of the fork. After walking for some time, I anticipated reaching the waterway, with a path leading to a parking lot, as indicated by my map app. However, to my surprise, I hadn't come across any signs of the waterway, and when I tried to check my phone again, I discovered it wasn't functioning. Now, deep in the woods, alone with my baby, and without any means of communication, I knew it was time to turn back and leave. Unfortunately, my heart sank when I once again encountered the man. He remained expressionless, his phone still pressed to his ear without speaking, and his concealed hand behind his back. Panic gripped me as questions flooded my mind. Why did he turn around on the path? Why did he choose the same fork as us? It became clear that he must have noticed our turn and followed suit. Every alarm in my body screamed at me to get out of there. As we approached him, I started jogging, hoping to give the impression that I was simply exercising along the trail. I kept jogging until we reached the tall grass, and only then did I dare to glance back. Thankfully, my son and I were alone again. I continued jogging until a considerable distance separated us from the trail. Finally, we waited in the dealership waiting room for the remaining time it took to service my car. I did return to the Arboretum afterward, but I have never ventured down that particular section of the trail again. Perhaps the man I encountered was merely a regular businessman, and nothing untoward was intended. However, personally, I would rather trust my instincts, take an unplanned jog, and avoid ignoring my gut feelings only to discover the consequences later. I'm a 17-year-old female who recently resigned from my job at a fast food chain. I had been working there for nearly 10 months, but there were several factors that made me hesitant to stay any longer. My usual shift was from 5 p.m. to 11 p.m. on weekends, during which I frequently encountered regular customers. I had even memorized most of their orders, promptly serving them as soon as I recognized their voices. Most of these customers were polite and occasionally left tips. However, one day, something unsettling occurred. On a particularly busy day, amidst the usual hustle and bustle, I noticed an unfamiliar man who seemed cautious and uneasy. It was early in my shift, and I was busy delivering food to the drive-through window. When I made eye contact with the man in his car, I immediately felt a sense of discomfort. Despite this, I brushed it off and continued with my work. After my manager set up my cash drawer, I took charge of the drive-thru, handling orders, payments, and other tasks. Due to the high volume of orders, I wasn't paying much attention to specific voices or menu choices. However, one voice caught my attention, a low, hesitant tone requesting a sandwich. I provided the man with the total, and he waited in line. When he reached the window, I realized it was the same man from earlier. I assumed he had forgotten to place his order earlier. As his car was quite low to the ground, he had to extend his arm to hand me his debit card. While doing so, he mumbled something under his breath, maintaining eye contact with me. Feeling uneasy, I asked, "I'm sorry, what was that?" He responded, "You're looking beautiful today." At this point, I felt extremely uncomfortable. Not only did I have a boyfriend, but I was also underage and not interested. Nervously, I replied, "Oh, thank you." I handed him his bag of food and quickly closed the window as he drove away. I casually complained about the man to some male coworkers, as we often did when encountering strange customers. However, I couldn't shake off the strange gut feeling that lingered. Later, when the average wait time in our line was around 10 minutes, I heard a familiar yet agitated and forceful voice over the microphone, asking for a cup of water. I caught a glimpse of his face through the windshield and walked away from the window, allowing my manager to handle him. This scenario repeated a few more times throughout the day. He would ask for straws and other free items, and it became evident to me that he was just trying to catch a glimpse of me. His presence frustrated me so much that I eventually went to the bathroom and cried. Normally, I had a thick skin when it came to such situations, but I had reached my limit. The rest of the night went on without any further encounters with him. I believed I would never have to see him again until my very last shift at the store, a few months later. It was a quiet evening, but much later in the day compared to our initial encounter. Although I didn't recognize his voice, I immediately recognized his face and car. Suppressing my pride, I processed his payment, trying my best to avoid eye contact. I alerted my manager, who kindly offered to distribute the food on my behalf. As expected, the man returned to the drive-thru shortly after, asking for a cup of water. This time, I knew better. I asked a male coworker to handle his request, explaining that I was occupied. After receiving the water, the man inquired with my coworker, "You guys close at 11 now, right?" I felt relieved that my mom was picking me up that night. I kept anxiously glancing out the windows, making sure he wasn't lurking outside, waiting for me. Call it paranoia, but having listened to enough true crime stories, I had become overly cautious. When I was 12 years old, an unsettling incident occurred that continues to make me uneasy, even though it happened more than half my lifetime ago. I often try to block it from my mind, not dwelling on what could have happened if it weren't for two compassionate strangers. On that day after school, I embarked on my 4-kilometer journey home along a busy road, walking alone. As I crossed intersections, I encountered a tall, disheveled man who seemed to notice me. It was challenging for me, being a child, to accurately gauge adults' ages, but I estimated him to be in his early 30s. The man began following me and attempted to engage me in conversation. He complimented me, insisting on becoming friends and inquiring about where I lived and whether my parents would be home. He bombarded me with numerous questions, but I tried to dismiss them politely. I refrained from answering any of his inquiries, hastening my pace as we neared my residential block. An intense uneasiness washed over me. I didn't want him to follow me home. His demeanor and unusual way of speaking to me, a child, unsettled me. To free myself from his presence, I reluctantly decided to provide him with a fake cell phone number, agreeing to answer his calls. Uncomfortable with the situation, I hurriedly left the scene. Several months passed without any encounters with that man, causing me to repress the incident completely. I presumed he was merely an odd stranger. However, things did not remain that way, as you might expect. Approximately 4 months later, while walking home from school once again, I found myself lost in my own thoughts, oblivious to my surroundings. Suddenly, I heard what sounded like hurried footsteps approaching from behind. Instinctively, I turned to look, only to find the same creepy man from before. He slowed his pace upon reaching me, but continued yelling furiously. He had discovered that I had given him a fake number, and his rage consumed him. He accused me of thinking I was superior to him, and expressed his anger openly. In that moment, I was overcome with fear, terrified that he might harm me. Despite my attempts, I couldn't grab the attention of any passing drivers. With him still following me and shouting incessantly, I speed-walked towards the nearest petrol station, thankfully not too far away. Upon my arrival, I immediately caught the attention of 2 robust men standing next to their pickup truck. Their faces mirrored concern as they noticed my terrified expression and the man trailing behind me. They swiftly approached, asking if I was all right. I was too frightened to speak and instead frantically shook my head, seeking refuge behind them. The 2 men demanded an explanation for the man's behavior, to which he fabricated a story about being my older brother. I remained silent, shaking my head in disagreement. Realizing the gravity of the situation, the 2 men began berating the man, suspecting him of wrongdoing. Seizing this distraction, I took the opportunity to flee. The man noticed my escape attempt and pursued me, but the burly men took offense to his actions. They promptly tackled him and forcefully placed him in the back of their pickup truck. He screamed as they sped away at an incredible speed, passing me and disappearing into the distance. I felt relieved that they had taken him away, but continued running until I reached the safety of my home. I couldn't comprehend the entire ordeal, but it profoundly shook me to my core. I never discovered where those 2 kind strangers took the creepy man or what became of him. Truthfully, I didn't want to know. I confided in my parents and altered my route home from school. Fortunately, I never saw him again, and for that, I am grateful. Although I couldn't articulate my needs in that moment, those compassionate strangers recognized my distress and handled the situation on my behalf. Even after all these years, I vividly remember the sheer terror I experienced, followed by the immense relief when they removed him from my presence. Recently, a memory resurfaced that compelled me to seek confirmation from my mother for reassurance. Unfortunately, her confirmation validated the truth behind it. The trigger for this recollection was an incident outside my workplace, where an individual innocently peered inside through a small window. This person posed no threat, but their visage unexpectedly evoked a long-forgotten memory from my early childhood, when I resided in my first home. I was 6 years old when we relocated from that house, shortly after a fence had been erected to ensure my safety as I began to explore the world on my own 2 feet. However, my parents remained perpetually cautious about granting me unrestricted access to the outdoors until we moved away. At the time, I resented their vigilance, but now, with the benefit of hindsight, I comprehend their underlying concerns. As it turns out, we had a neighbor a few doors down who was a registered offender. His social worker had mandated that he inform his neighbors of his presence upon moving in. This individual had developed a peculiar penchant for engaging in disconcerting behavior within the neighborhood. On one occasion, he sprinted across the street, leaving a human-sized dent in our neighbor's garage door. Furthermore, he brazenly entered another neighbor's home uninvited, trembling, and implored her to hold him. She promptly ejected him from her premises and notified the authorities upon discovering his inappropriate arousal. I gleaned much of this unsettling information through my own investigation, subsequent to my mother's confirmation of my recollection. I stumbled upon his Facebook page, where a photograph of him erased any lingering doubts, vividly reinstating his image in my mind. Even through the medium of a screen, the sight of him made me instantly nauseous. According to my memory, I was seated in our living room, engrossed in television, when I sensed a gaze fixated upon me. In broad daylight, I turned towards the front windows, only to find a man with his face and hands pressed against the glass, a man who bore a striking resemblance to the one I had encountered on Facebook. His enormous eyes and alarmingly wide grin were directed at me. I distinctly recall being swiftly whisked away into another room, enveloped in the arms of someone who, as my mother confirmed, must have been my grandmother, babysitting me at the time. Needless to say, I am profoundly relieved that we eventually relocated from that residence.